Well, welcome to all of you on behalf of Pax Christi and, of course, the convener of Pax Christi, Reverend Harry Kerr. A warm welcome to all of you for this important occasion. As we all know, this is a transformative moment in our history, in the history of the world, and of course, in Australia's place in the world, its future place, and in all of this, China will play a very, very important role, as we all know. Before we go too far, let me begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of this land. The land on which we in Australia meet today and pay our respects to elders past and present. We reaffirm that this land was never ceded and enthusiastically support the Uluru Statement from the heart. And now, if I may, a word about Pax Christi for those of you who may not know much about it, though no doubt many of you will. It is one of the oldest peace groups, uninterrupted to the present, in Australia. Established in 1973, we will soon be celebrating our 50th anniversary. Much has happened during this half century, and Pax Christi has taken on all of the major issues of war and peace, violence and non-violence in our world during this time. Its approach is one of reflection, advocacy, and education. Well, it's now time, I think, to introduce our guest today. Emeritus Professor Colin MACKERRAS, distinguished specialist in Chinese history, musical theatre, and ethnic minorities in China, as well as Australia-China relations and Western images of China. He has written or edited some 40 books and authored some 200 scholarly articles on many of the issues I've just mentioned. He's an officer in the Order of Australia and Fellow of the Academy of Humanities of Australia. Before I start, I should say that I have muted everyone, but when we come to the Q&A session, in which I'll invite people to make either very, very brief comments or pose a question, I will unmute people. I will give people the opportunity to unmute themselves and then to contribute. And I will be explaining how we'll tackle that process when we get to it, after we've had an engaging time listening to what Professor MACKERRAS has to say. Colin, it's such a pleasure to meet you again. It's a long
pleasure
time.
for me too, Joe. Pleasure for me too.
It's a long time since we have met.
Yes.
And
too long.
Yes, and I'm sure we share any number of interests, and from time to time we both contribute to pearls and irritations.
We do.
And no doubt, I don't know about the pearls, we contribute to the irritation of the odd person. Now, let me ask you the first, and I think important question. You have had a very long-standing interest in and engagement with China.
Yeah.
When did China first capture your interest and imagination? Could you take us back to when that happened and how it happened?
Well, it happened in the late 50s, and it was like this. My mother, who is my late mother, who was herself not interested in China, she was interested in Europe, very interested in Europe, you know, especially France, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so on. She was very, she knew a lot about Europe, even though she was born in Australia. she saw an advertisement for an Asian Studies scholarship in the newspaper, and she recommended me to apply. And my father also thought that was a good idea. And I did apply and I got one. And I went to Canberra and I studied Chinese, Japanese, and Chinese history, Japanese history, and a bit of Indian history. And then I got a chance to go to Cambridge in England. And in Cambridge, I got a chance. I did a thesis on the Tang Dynasty history. That's from about 618 to 97, a long time ago, Chinese history. And after that, while I was in Cambridge, I got a chance to go and actually live in China, because I met a friend in the market square in Cambridge who told me he was going to China, and I said to him, if the legation in London asks you if you know of anybody else, could you give them my name? And they did ask him, and he did give them my name, and they got in touch with me. And that was a transformative opportunity, because in those days, very, very few Australians lived in China, hardly any. And I mean, I had no trouble getting my visa validated for China, because although it wasn't, in those days, the Australian passport was not valid for China. There were 3 countries, China was one of them, but I had no trouble going to London and getting it validated. So I went with my wife and lived in China from 1964 to 66. We taught English. It was very, very unusual opportunity. And I mean, looking back on it, it was a transformative and in general, a pleasant one. I mean, I know that there were a lot of nasty things happening in China in those days, but I made friends. And I mean, there are still nasty things happening in a lot of places. But I mean, I got to know the Chinese people. I made a lot of friends. I got to love the place, and I still love it. And I have very good Chinese friends. And I look back on that with pleasure. And not only that, but our first son was born in China. He was actually born in China. And that was very unusual for an Australian to be born in China in those days.
Colin, before I pose a related question, could I mention to everyone, you would probably get more out of your participation if you were to go to the view icon, top right-hand corner, and if you haven't been used to use of Zoom, you were to click speaker rather than gallery at this point. So if you can do that, click speaker rather than gallery, you will get a much more of the body language, particularly which is important because that conveys a great deal as well as the words. I was going to ask you, Colin, the 1960s,
yep,
it's a long time ago. What has sustained your interest and engagement with China all these years?
Well, I returned to Australia in 1969 with my family, my wife and baby. And I got a PhD scholarship to do a PhD on Peking opera at the Australian National University. I've always been interested in Western opera. I've been passionate about Western opera since I was a child. And I got interested in Chinese opera when I got interested in China. And while I was in China, I collected a lot of books in Chinese language about Chinese theatre, Chinese drama, history, and I did a PhD on that subject, which was subsequently published. And I mean, I don't apologize for that. I think it's very important to understand other people's culture. And I like Peking opera. That doesn't mean I don't like Western opera. And I think it's a very beautiful art. And the other thing, which I do think is also very interesting about this, is that I took a lot of notice of the social context of the history of the Peking opera, and I think that's also very interesting. And I also think the social context and historical context of the history of Western theatre and other theatres is concerned.
Yes.
So that's what I did my PhD thesis. And you say what sustained my interest? Having done that, I then got a job at the ANU for a little while with Professor Wang Gungwu, who's a really, he lives in Singapore still, a wonderful man. He was my mentor. I still regard him with great affection. And I mean, he's very, very old now, but he's still alive and he's still active. He's a remarkable person. Anyway, after that, I got a chair at Griffith University. That was in 1974, when they were just setting up the Griffith University School of Modern Asian Studies, it was called then. And I've been here ever since. I mean, that's a long, long time. I'm retired now. I retired quite a while ago in 2004. But I still have attachment. I still have an office. And during all that time, I went to China numerous times. I altogether, I mean, I've lost count, but it'll be getting on for 80 times now. And I went in order to do research, in order to take my students there, in order to set up exchanges, in order for tourism and for teaching, especially for teaching in the last few years since I retired from Griffith University in 2004. I've been many times to teach at Griffith University in China, especially at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, which was the same university that I taught in the 60s. So I've kept up those links all these years. And you say, what sustained my interest? Well, that's what sustained my interest. And also, I mean, I just love all those friends. They're very good friends. And I mean, I know there's political problems, etc., but I mean, relations, people-to-people relations, they shouldn't change because of that. And they were very kind to me in the 60s. They've still been good to me. I liked the place. I liked them. And I still think it's a very interesting and important place. And the sustaining of the teaching and the sustaining of the research is, I think, is very important.
Yes, and it's probably a more important place than it was 50, 60 or 70 years ago.
I would say so, yes.
Yes, but before we come to all of that, China experienced, didn't it? I mean, just to go back a little bit in history,
yeah,
profound humiliation at the hands of the West.
Yeah, it did.
Is that your view? Is that
yes, I would. That is my view. I mean, beginning from the Opium Wars, but I mean, the climax of it, I think, was in 1900. You know, the 8 powers invaded China because they didn't think they were treating the missionaries properly. I mean, it was quite a trivial incident that got it all off. But in response to that, the 8 powers, eight European and 7 European and also Japan invaded China, and as a in the treaty, or the so-called Boxer Protocol that was signed after that, the Western powers demanded an enormous amount of money as a recompense. And what they were in fact doing, I mean, if you put it in plain language, they were asking the Chinese to pay to be invaded. And that's very humiliating. I mean, let's be fair, the Americans later used it for education and good things like that. But the whole idea that this should happen, that somebody should, they need to pay, and they got nothing from it except humiliation. I mean, that's, of course, it's a very complicated thing when I say nothing. It depends on your point of view in a lot of these things. But then since then, of course, then Japan, being invaded by Japan, they had a war with Japan in 1894 to 95, which they lost. And Japan then seized some of Chinese territory and continued to humiliate China during the early part of the 20th century, and then, of course, invaded it again in 1937 and kept in and remained in occupation, killing very large numbers of people until 1945. I mean, the Chinese during that period, they were humiliated from all sides, and at the very beginning, when they started signing these so-called unequal treaties, so-called because they were unequal, the Chinese simply had no idea what they were letting themselves in for. They thought that the West might have some good feelings towards them, and there were people who were wanting to have modernization, which they thought they could get from the West. But then, they got lower and lower in everybody's esteem and kicked about and pushed about and invaded and killed and so on. I mean, it was a terrible time. I mean, you could put another spin, and I know a lot of people do put another spin. They could say, well, we brought them some good things like modernization and Christianity and things like that. I mean, it's the history. When you look at it, it's always a very fraught area. But I can tell you right now that the Chinese that I've spoken to anyway, they think that it's a period of humiliation, and I can see perfectly well why they would think that. And anyway, that's my answer.
And that gives us a bit of context for the role of the Chinese Communist Party and eventually the successful revolution of 49.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that the Communist Party claims to have been the one that brought it out of the humiliation. Again, that's a complex question. But I think overall, what strikes me about the Communist Party is that they did establish links with the people, and they did go for the lower. Well, I don't. When I say low, I mean poorer. They did establish more links with peasants who were very, very poor in those days. I mean, the extent of poverty is so great. It was so great in those days. And when I say poverty, I really mean absolute poverty. There are figures about all of that, but I mean the figures that apply to that period before. It might be more difficult to find them accurately, but there are studies that have been done about this, and the point I want to make is that the Communist Party were the only ones that really cared about the poor people, the workers and so on, and especially the peasants. And I think that after the war against Japan, that stood them in good stead. I mean, they were also very cunning, or they were very smart politically. They knew how to go about things, and they did have also. I mean, Mao Zedong. I mean, nowadays his reputation as a leader is somewhat tarnished for various reasons that we can go into if you want to. But I mean, he was very skillful at getting people on side and in getting the Chinese mass on side. And he was also very skillful in dealing with the Kuomintang.
Yes. Colin, if we look at what has transpired since 49, the Maoist period, and then we've had a succession of other leaders. Is it fair to talk about the Maoist era and the post-Maoist era, or would you want to break up this 70-year history somewhat differently?
Well, I mean, I think it's reasonable to do that. I mean, recently the Chinese are interested in yet another period, which is about Xi Jinping. But I mean, it seems to me that the post-Mao era. I mean, Mao Zedong died in 1976. At the end, having he launched the revolution, which made for revolutionary change in China, and he did improve some things for some people, but he also got himself into very big problems. Like during the Great Leap Forward, for example, there was a gigantic famine, very bad famine. And also the Cultural Revolution was very, very, chaotic. I remember it clearly. I remember I was there at the beginning of it. It was very chaotic, and people were being, marched through the streets with placards around their necks and publicly humiliated and all that sort of thing. So, I mean, when we say the post-Mao Zedong died in 1976, and in 1978, at the end of 1978, Deng Xiaoping became the actual leader. He didn't have the titles of leader. He wasn't the chairman of the party or anything like that. He was the chairman of the Central Military Commission, which was a very important role. But he's the architect of the reform period and the reform policies in economics which I think have done a lot of good for China. I mean, I can develop that if you want me to, but I think I do want to develop it to say two periods, Mao Zedong and post-Mao. I think that is, and it's also correct to subdivide that post-Mao period. I mean, when you're looking at history, how you periodize it is always an interesting question. But I think that Deng Xiaoping it was who brought in reforms which are still relevant to this day, and which I think have done a great deal of good for China.
Well, a lot of people have referred over the last, let's say, 40 or so years, which is from Deng Xiaoping onwards, the Chinese economic miracle. And it's interesting to note the World Bank has referred to it as the most dramatic and speedy period of economic growth in human history.
Yeah.
And that's the World Bank, not a Chinese outfit. What do you make of this economic transformation of China? Because you've been there so often and you've noted how things have changed. How do you, what do you make of it, and how do we make sense of it? What is its significance for the people of China and the rest of the world?
I mean, we could, if you like, I could begin. Well, what does it mean? What are the signs of it? As you say, I've been going to China for a long time. What I see is a lot of modernization, especially in the cities, not only in the cities, however, also in the countryside. People with a standard of technology that is quite unbelievable if you compare with what it used to be like in the days when I was there first. Where you have these high-speed railways, the best in the world, a lot of infrastructure and things like that. Everybody has an iPhone. People live they're much more self-confident in their lives. Their standard of living has gone up immensely. And of course, China has a lot of trade now, and its economy is next to the United States in terms of size, and depending how you measure it, it's number one already. But if it's not, if you measure it in some ways, it'll catch up with the United States quite soon, and that is quite extraordinary for a country that poor, I would say. Quite extraordinary. And in fact, you said it was unprecedented in human history. I think that is quite likely. Now, as for how this could happen, well, I think I'd like to point to three things. Firstly, I think that the Chinese people, well, I know this a national characteristic, and of course it doesn't apply to everyone. But I think on the whole, they are very hardworking, and they're very focused in what they do. I mean, of course, there are people who are not like that, but on the whole, that is certainly my experience with Chinese people. They take life very seriously and they work very hard. I think on the whole, they're quite happy to help the state and to help other people. There's a saying that the Chinese people put a lot of emphasis on the community as against the Westerners who put a lot of emphasis on the individual. Now, that you could say it's nonsense, because there are a lot of Chinese who put a lot of emphasis on the individual, and there are a lot of Westerners who put a lot of emphasis on the community too. Of course there are. But I think as a big, broad generalization, it's probably not ridiculous to talk like that. And I think it's certainly it may be one factor that helps. Now, and then the next thing I do want to emphasize is, because, I mean, I know a lot of people deny it, and that is, I think that the leadership has been very good. I mean, Deng Xiaoping was very smart, and the way he got people involved and the way he managed to change the policies. I mean, he did. There was the massacre in 1989. I'm not going to justify that, and that was bad. But the way he managed the economic growth, the policies he put in, letting people, giving them their head, not putting them down all the time if they did well, which is what happened in the Cultural Revolution. not criticizing them all the time. I think that was good leadership. And I think the way he handled it and the way he was able to get into power was pretty good. I think China owes a lot to him. I mean, I know that there have been others since he died at the end of the 20th century. He died in 1997, but and then we've got 23 years since then. But I think on the whole, that leadership has continued. Well, that's a very complicated question. But I think on the whole, they have been well led. On the whole, they've been well led. And of course, then a third a factor, which the Americans like to point to all the time, and that is foreign help. I mean, the fact that the Americans, Kissinger went and he said in 1971, and then Nixon went in 1972. They opened up policies of openness, that would allow for the openness to the outside world. I think that definitely helped. I'm not going to give it all the credit for things, but I think it definitely helped. I heard there was a man, Tom Tugendhat, who's a conservative politician. He said just a couple of days ago, he thought that anything the Communist Party did was to make China poor, and anything that the West did was to make it rich. Well, I think that is utter nonsense. I think he doesn't understand history. He approached it from an extremely narrow, broad, and narrow-minded point of view. And I think that the way the Chinese have not only developed the economy, but also been able to get rid of absolute poverty. I mean, there's plenty of poverty still in China, but absolute poverty, which you can measure according to a specific, specific standard, they now claim it's been completely eliminated. Well, even if it's only partly true, and I believe that it's based on what I've seen, I think it's largely true. That is an astounding achievement for a country like China. If you consider the
size, huh?
Yeah, well, considering its size and the poverty that it had not so long ago, it's an astounding achievement. I mean, if you compare with other, like a country like India, for example, which I respect India, and I respect a lot of what they've done. I mean, they've got their own history, but if you compare this, it's just it's miles apart. China has just go so much better. And I mean, the figures that are put out by the United Nations Development Program, they all point to rising. They say that poverty, absolute poverty, has been largely reduced from the world. That is before the pandemic, by the way. I mean, I think after that, it's a different kind of story. But China is responsible for about 70% of the elimination of absolute poverty in the world. And I mean, I really think that is a great achievement, and it certainly affects the Chinese people. Can I quote another statistics? There are figures for maternity mortality rates, infant mortality rates. Well, what's the use of? Of course, you need to have women to be able to have children without dying and without their children dying. Now, those maternity mortality rates, infant mortality rates, have dropped enormously in China, and they're now better than the United States. They're lower than the United States, and that is extraordinary to me. Because those things matter. People who think they're going to take the risk of dying every time they have a child. I mean, that's not life. And that still exists in a lot of places in the world. It existed in China not so long ago. But now, it's better than the US. That's extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. Well, as the economy has been transformed,
yeah.
Would you say society has been transformed or not?
Well, I think society has been transformed in some ways. For example, it was very unequal when the communists came to power. Mao Zedong tried to, does equality matter? I think to some extent it matters. I mean, I won't say it's not necessarily the be all and end all, but I do think that if society is only measured by the elites, that doesn't really, that's not a very good measure as far as I'm concerned. And the fact is that China did become much more equal under Mao Zedong, much more equal. Now, Deng Xiaoping's policies were not good for equality. In fact, they made it a bit less equal. And the reason why they did that was because they gave people their head, you know? I mean, like if you have money, you can be rich, you can make more money, get richer and richer, and that's no problem. That's good for society. In other words, it's a little bit like the capitalist way of thinking. Now, that's a good thing in some ways because it gives people their head and because it helps the society to get richer. But after a while, it becomes too unequal, and it certainly has become too unequal in China recently. And now Xi Jinping is trying to reverse that. And now he may have a problem doing that, but I think it's a good thing to try. Of course, that sort of thing has to be handled very carefully, because if you go too far in that, you end up destroying everything, which is what happened in the Cultural Revolution. They tried to make it more equal. But I mean, I give him credit, that is Xi Jinping, for trying to make it a bit more equal.
That's the idea of common prosperity.
That's
right?
the idea of common prosperity, indeed. Now, as for other things about society that you talk about, let's take the position of women. That's an important thing. It's an important side of the society. Now, the position of women has risen enormously under the People's Republic. Now, I know you can quote all kinds of figures, and people do, but you know, if you look at the first part of the People's Republic, the status of women rose greatly, and it's continued to rise. And in the 21st century, they have contributed much more to the economy than ever before. And again, you can cite figures about how many there are in positions of power. And in the Politburo, I don't think there are any at the moment. So, I mean, they're not doing that well at that kind of level. But in the other levels, they are doing well. I mean, there are quite a few female mayors, so, you know, party secretaries, governors, and all that sort of thing throughout the country. And I think that's a good thing. And they certainly say women are holding up half the sky. And all I can say is that given my experiences in China, I mean, I know they're only with a certain type of person on the whole, but they certainly would confirm that. So, I mean, I take it as real. Now, I have heard also, can I expand a little bit on this? I've heard people say that in the recent times, the most recent times, by meaning the last 2 or 3 years, they're going backwards. For mainly because Xi Jinping wants to expand the population and he wants to put more emphasis on women as mothers, you know, rather than as power holders or as producers in the economy. Now, I think that may be to some extent true, but all I can say is that a lot of the women I've spoken to, they don't see any contradiction, like the way a lot of women don't hear it in Australia. Why can't you be a mother and a good mother and have children and contribute to the economy and to contribute to the profession and so on? There may be a slight change in emphasis. I think that may well be true. I think there's a slight change in ideology, but not an essential change. And I think that the position of women in China is really very, very impressive in most respects. I mean, of course, you can find exceptions. I'm not going to make absolute statements, but that's my feeling. Now, is that enough on society? I mean, there are lots of other things.
I think so.
Lots of other things to talk about: minorities, religion, and so on.
That's what I was leading up to, Colin. What about the whole question, which is contentious in the West, of the way China treats minorities, its minorities, and human rights more generally? What's your assessment of that can of worms, if you like?
Yeah. Okay. Now, yeah, shall we start with minorities?
Yes.
Maybe because I mean human rights. Yeah. Okay. Well, as far as minorities are concerned, you can look at the history, and I have of how minorities have been treated in China for over a long period. It seems to me that in the early part of the People's Republic, they were treated much better than had been the case before, and their standard of living rose, and their standard of recognition rose also. During the Cultural Revolution, it seemed to go in reverse. And Mao Zedong said class struggle is the key link, and he didn't seem to care about, ethnic recognition so much. Now, after that, in the 70s and 80s, that identity started rising again, and it rose quite substantially. And the position of minorities also continued to rise. I mean, for example, they were exempt from the one child per couple policy, although they did have, each had different policies on population, and that's an interesting question too. Now, I think that in the last few years, by which I mean since about 2015, there's been a change of emphasis, which means that the nature of a minority and minority identity feelings has got less emphasis, and emphasis on Chineseness as a whole, rather than any particular ethnic group. Well, it tends to mean the Han, because they're the largest in population and in majority. That tends to get more. However, having said that, there is still an emphasis on minorities. It's not the case, as some people say, that the Chinese are trying to stamp them out or trying to not recognize them. That is just not the case. You can see official statements which give the total large of that. Now, as for human rights, let me start with the most contentious one of all, which is the contemporary situation with the Uyghurs. Okay. Now, who are the Uyghurs? They are a Turkic ethnic group. They speak a Turkic language, and they mostly live in Xinjiang, which is in the northwestern part of China. The northwestern, it's the most extreme northwestern province level unit. And they are Muslims, and they've been Muslims for many centuries. Just recently, there's been this policy, they say, of stamping out terrorism. They're trying to stamp out terrorism. That's what the Chinese government claims. Now, it is true, and let's be very clear about this, it is true that there were quite a few terrorist incidents which killed quite a few people. There's a whole row of them in Xinjiang, especially since since the late part of the 20th century, actually, but going on until and getting worse, actually, in the 21st century, especially in 2009, there was a big not exactly an uprising, but a very large disturbance in Urumqi, which killed quite a lot of people. Now, in my opinion, the suppressing terrorism is a good thing, but I think that the Chinese have overreacted in this, and I think that's a great shame. And it is a human rights abuse. How serious, I'm not going to say, but I think it is. But I will also go on to say that the charge of genocide, which I've seen put lately, I mean, Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, in his last day in office, charged China with genocide. Now, that is just nonsense, in my opinion. Genocide is when you try to stamp out a given ethnic group, and that has just not happened. The population is going up. There has not been a policy of killing them, and I just don't buy this genocide business. Now, if I wanted to put another thing about human rights, well, I suppose we're going to talk about that in a little while. But I think one aspect of human rights is having people living a decent life. And I went to Xinjiang in 2018, and I was very, very struck by two things, actually. Firstly, how modern it was, how good the standard of living of people were, including in the countryside. Everywhere I went, and I went to quite a few places, they seemed to have a very good standard of living. But I was also very struck by how much surveillance there was. And I don't like that, of course. I mean, being fair, most of the police that were Uyghurs, they're Uyghurs and not Han. And they were very polite to me. I mean, I didn't have any trouble with them. But I didn't go around, I didn't look at, examine the human rights situation. So, I mean, it's, I'm not saying that I was, I wasn't looking into that. You know, I went there because a friend of mine that lives there and he invited me to go. But can I, if you don't mind, can I compare that with how the West has behaved? I mean, I know what the West does doesn't necessarily justify anything, but in reaction to terrorism, what the Americans did, they sent in troops to Afghanistan, invaded the country, overthrew the government, killed hundreds of thousands of people, made war in Iraq, killed quite a few people there as well, to change the regimes. And then after 20 years of trying to do this, and no doubt making some contributions in terms of modernizations and things, then withdrew with their tails between their head, having killed hundreds of thousands of people. Now, if you compare that with China, China has not killed people in Xinjiang. It's done things we mightn't like. That's true, and I don't like them either. But it hasn't gone out to kill people. So my verdict on what you're saying is, well, what about cultural recognition? Now, I must say one thing I was very perturbed by when I went there was the treatment of Islam. It seemed to me that Islam, there was a lot of pressure on Islam, probably persecution, although I didn't see signs of persecution. I certainly saw signs of pressure. For example, some of the mosques that I used to frequent, I've been to Xinjiang several times, and I know the situation there quite a bit. And some of them seem to be closed down, or at least I didn't see evidence that they were functioning normally. And there have been, of course, reports of mosques being desecrated. I really can't comment on that because I don't know, and I'm not prepared to believe all those reports just as they come. I mean, I'm not prepared to say they're nonsense either. But I really think that the way the West has been going on about Xinjiang and using it as a stick to say that China is, in a sense, an evil place and a bad place, which is what's been happening, I really don't agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it probably sets the stage what you've been telling us about different facets of contemporary China. For the way it sees its place and its role in the region, our region, and the world more widely. And that, of course, is what's causing a lot of apparent concern in many of the Western countries. So, if we take the region first, unification of China remains a central goal, obviously, of the Chinese Communist Party, of the government. And that, of course, now means primarily Taiwan. And the claim is being made that China is threatening to use force to get its way on reunification and using force to gain control of the South China Seas and perhaps East China Sea. How do you read what's happening in that part of the world?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Now, how I read it is that, as you said, China wants to reunify the country, and they've put a high priority on that for a long time. As for saying that Taiwan is part of China, they've been saying that ever since I've been going there, and they've been giving an emphasis on that. Now, will they use force to take Taiwan? I doubt it very much. I doubt it very much because they don't want a war, and they think they can do it in other ways. They may be able to, put in blockades and things like that, short of a war. I'm not sure about that. I do know that Xi Jinping wants to have China reunified by the time he dies. Now, whether that's going to happen, I'm afraid I don't know. I won't rule out the possibility of an armed attack, but I think it is extremely unlikely. Now, would it be aggression? Well, I mean, it depends how you look at it, because the world up to now has regarded Taiwan as being part of China. So, I mean, it's not really the same as doing an independent foreign state. Now, for that reason, Joan, I do want to talk a bit about this. Just in the last few months, there have been speculation, and I mean the Americans and the Taiwan government has been claiming that it is independent, and the American government seems to be withdrawing from with recognizing it as part of China. And in other words, they're saying that it would be a provocative and a act of war if they were to try and take Taiwan again. Now, would the Americans send in troops to stop them? Well, I don't know. They might, but if they did, I don't think there's any guarantee they'd win. And if they did, the people who would be most damaged would be the Taiwan people themselves. Of course, there is another possibility, which I think is quite disturbing. Well, I mean, but anyway, I'll just go on. What if the Chinese were to take Taiwan by some means other than force, and then there was to be, mutinies and uprisings and so on, rebellions and so on by the Taiwanese people, which the Chinese put down? I mean, that also would have a lot of bloodshed. Of course, the Americans would come in on the side of the Taiwan people. But I mean, again, I don't know who would win, but I do know that there would be a lot of bloodshed. And I think that would be that would be terrible. That would be just the worst thing that could happen. And I certainly don't want to see it. I don't think that the Chinese, I suppose, if they say, well, we want to reunify the country, including Taiwan, by an X date, they've said 2049. Well, that's a fair way off still. But still, it's a date. That is dangerous, in my opinion. I certainly hope that there will not be a war. I don't expect to see a war, but I have to add that the way both the Americans and the Chinese have been veering in the last few months, I find quite worrying and disturbing. And I really think it's a pity that, I see lots of statements that are made by American spokespeople, and they worry me, in the sense that they don't seem to care about China's bottom line anymore. They regard Taiwan as an independent state, which is exactly the opposite of what the Chinese say. And I mean, when you have the danger of war is there, I mean, how can it be avoided? I mean, that to me is one of the biggest worries about the current situation in Taiwan, in that region. No, but I suppose I do want to add, in case I sound too bleak, that I still have some optimism. I mean, I think it would be. I think there's a hope that this won't develop, and that, I mean, it seems to me the status quo is actually not so bad. I mean, and I don't expect to see a war, but I do think that you can't rule it out. Now, as for more general questions, do you want me to continue on this?
Yes, do go on.
About their place in the world.
Yes.
I think that the Chinese are definitely becoming more confident of their place in the world. And that is a reaction to the fact that they felt they were being so badly treated before. We talked about the history of it before. I won't go into that again. I think they expect to be treated as equals. I think that they expect to have their influence increase. I think they're taking measures to increase their influence as a big economy. Personally, I can't see why they shouldn't do that. I mean, if you're a great power, I don't think it's too bad to expect that your influence will increase. If you're going to then follow that up with armed invasions of other countries, that, of course, is quite a different thing. But I really don't see that in the case of China up to now. I mean, I will be just recently in the last few days, we had this OSAC, or OXA. And I think that which assumes, the team seems to assume that China's going to invade Australia over the next while. I think that is highly unlikely. I think there is no sign whatever that they would like to do that or to send troops. I think they want to expand their influence. That's true.
Yes. Colin, we'll come to Australia in just 1 minute.
Yeah, sure.
I think what you're saying is that China is not so interested outside of its own region to use military power to project its influence in the world.
Yeah, I am saying that.
It will try and do it economically, and I suppose the Belt and Road Initiative is a classic example.
Yeah, I do agree. Now, as for the Belt and Road, do you want to talk about that?
Yes, just for people who may not be very familiar with what that involves, that would be good.
Well, it's an infrastructure program that Xi Jinping introduced in 2013, and it's got a maritime one into the south, and then over the great Eurasian continent. And it wants to have, they want to have trade, and they want to have infrastructure, railways and pipelines and things like that across the great Eurasian continent. And I just will point out that's actually quite new. I mean, they talk about the Silk Road a lot, and there was a Silk Road from the Han Dynasty, that is the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century AD, and through the Middle Ages. But then it got replaced, more or less, from the 15th century onwards, tended to be replaced by the maritime trade that the European powers introduced. Well, now the Chinese government wants to reintroduce that across the great Eurasian continent, and that seems to me a good thing. I mean, are they trying to take it all over? Well, I don't see the signs of that. I see the signs that they want influence, but I don't see the signs that they want to take. And that is, that is European style thinking. I don't want to blame the Europeans, but if you think of the way in which Christopher Columbus, he went across and resumed the interlinkages between the European and the American continents, just within a few decades of that, we find conquest. The Spanish, overturning the great Mexican, the Aztec Empire, and further other places in the American, the British coming along as well, and founding their things, and conquest followed. Now, will conquest follow as far as China is concerned? I don't see the signs of it.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Colin, would you unmute yourself?
Yeah. Yes, I am.
That's
okay.
It. Yes, so we missed the last sentence or two.
Well, I just said that the Europeans had followed discovery with conquest within a very short time. And I asked whether China was going to do that as well. And I just said, I don't see the signs of it. I think they want to increase their economic presence. I think that's true. And I think they want to increase investments. Will that lead to conquest? Well, I don't see the signs of it. I mean, I can't rule it out.
Would you say it might lead to political influence?
I think it will lead to political influence, but whether that will lead to taking over the country the way the Europeans did, really, I doubt it.
Mhm.
I don't think they
China
need
doesn't
that.
have a record of long-term projection of long-distance projection.
No,
of
no, it
military
doesn't.
power. Mm.
I mean, some people accuse it of expanding its territory under the Manchus. There's a whole literature about that. But as for the way Britain did, no, the way France, no, it hasn't got a record of that.
Mhm. Well, let's come to the last bit of this part of our forum.
Yeah.
Australia.
Yeah.
How is Australia viewing China at the government level and at the society-wide level?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a very good question. And I'm afraid for me, it's a very sad question. You see, the thing is that I believe in a good relationship with China. I think it's good to have a peaceful relationship and a fruitful relationship. And I want that. And I've always argued for that. I still argue for that. Now, as for the reality, that used to be the case. In the last few years, it's declined dramatically for various reasons. And the most important reason, I think, is because the Americans under Trump decided that China was not a partner, but a strategic rival and a strategic competitor. They spelled that out in documents at the end of 2017. And I think that Trump, I think that was a great shame. And we, of course, we didn't go, we had our own policy, but I think that's muddied the water because it's meant that the Americans immediately put on tariffs and all kinds of trade barriers. And then when the pandemic came, Trump immediately blamed the Chinese for it. Now, that was a very provocative thing to do, in my opinion. And we did too. We said, let's, when the pandemic came, we called Maurice Payne, called for an investigation into the origins. And she did that under the circumstances, at least as the Chinese saw it, that she blamed them. And they thought, and I think they've got a point. If you've got a pandemic on your hands, the first thing you do is to try and stop it. But Trump made no attempt to do that. He argued that it didn't have, I mean, we've done differently. I mean, I must say that. I think we've done quite well in terms of coping with it. But I think that the way in which we have blamed China in a series of things and put a bad interpretation on everything they do, I think it's been a great pity. Now, of course, I know it's not all China's fault. I know there are these trade bans, and I think they are a great shame, and I hope they don't last. I hope that we resume those trade in wine and all those barley and all those things. I just would like to add that although the Americans say they have our back, they have benefited from this because the Chinese buy wine and stuff from them instead of us. I mean, I think it's gross hypocrisy the way the Americans have been going on about this. But anyway, that's how I see it. And you say you added in your question, and what's the net result is that we have a bad relationship at the moment. And I can comment on this latest thing, but maybe later. But as you asked me also about people, now that to me is quite a sad thing also, because according to the surveys that have been carried out by the Lowy Institute, among others, but the Lowy Institute is the best one. They carried out every year. They carry out a survey of what people are thinking in Australia about international questions. And they always have quite a lot about China, as well as about other places, of course. But they do. We're talking about China now. And what that shows is the trust in China, trust in Xi Jinping, and has declined dramatically over the last couple of years. And what it seems to mean is that people in Australia just don't like China anymore. They don't seem to like it. Now, of course, there is another side. There is another side. People-to-people relationships still exist. But of course, the pandemic has made that very difficult too, because it's difficult to come from China to here now, and vice versa is also the same. But all in all, what it seems to amount to is that relations between China and Australia have deteriorated both at the official level and at the popular level. And I regard that as an extreme pity. And I think it is, I hope it doesn't last. But the way I just keep on hoping the government, they seem to want to, well, poke the dragon's eye, I know is the way a lot of people have put it. They seem to me anyway, look, I know maybe I'm too biased, and maybe I've been to China too often and like the place too much, or what, I don't know. But it seems to me that they're going out of their way to gratuitously insult China. And I think that what can be gained by that? And then they complain because China, insults us.
Bites back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is such a pity, Joe, and I hope it can be changed.
Colin, it's not just the government, is it? It's the powerful interests behind the government.
Yeah, I mean, the Murdoch press, for example, you look at the Murdoch press, it's disgraceful. I can mention names that I think are even more disgraceful, but maybe I shouldn't in a public forum like this, but I just think it's so awful. I mean, I read some of those things in the Murdoch press, and I read just so much conflicts with what I know and what I experience, and I just think it is so unfortunate because they're very influential, those people.
So what I'm trying to, I suppose, lead up to is that the shift that you've noted and that the Lowy Institute picks up through its surveys, the shift in public attitudes, public mood, is to a very large extent conditioned by the information and the analysis and the reporting to which most Australians are exposed. It
looks like that to me, yeah. I mean, I go to a gymnasium and I talk to people there, and I found why do I mention it? Because the attitude of just ordinary people who go to a gymnasium, they like the Chinese as people, but they think their government is terrible, and they think that our government is right to go on about the Chinese as they do and so on. And it's just a big mood change. And I think it is very, very unfortunate. And I think you're right. I think it is, at least in part, and I would go further, I would think it's largely, very largely driven by this hostile mainstream media. Last question from me. No doubt you're going to get many more from people who have joined, participants who joined us. The Chinese community, or the Chinese-speaking community in Australia. How do they feel about what's happening? How do they view China? I think it varies a lot. The ones that I talk to and hear their views of a lot think it's very unfortunate, and they think that China is being misjudged. They think that it's not nearly as bad as people say. But there are, of course, others who don't think that. There are others who think that it's even worse, that it's very bad, and you have a mixture of views. But I would like to add that I think the surveys which have shown bigger, more discriminatory attitudes against individual Chinese in Australia, that has grown. It shows that the attitude is quite bad, in some quarters. Again, you can't be absolute about this. But the final point before I stop on this one, the way the government was trying to demonize a lot of those students, I thought was very, very unfortunate. I mean, I don't doubt that, in fact, I will affirm, most of them seem to support their government in China. But that to go on from there to say that they're just, people trying to undermine Australian democracy and they're agents for the Chinese Communist Party against Australia. I think that's just nonsense. And I think it's very unfair. I think it's very harmful to society. I think it's very harmful to relations between ethnic groups in Australia. And I just hope it gets reversed.
And our universities have been squeezed by this pressure, haven't they?
They certainly have, because it means that we don't get so many Chinese students. And that's a very big deal. I mean, we used to get lots of them, and they were not only very good students, but they also brought a lot of money into the system, and they created a good impression, I think, on the whole of Chinese in Australia. They're very well behaved. They're very good people. I mean, the ones I know are anyway, and the ones I've had anything to do with. And I think that it's very unfortunate that the universities seem to be going off China. And I mean, there's all kinds of implications in this, which I hope are reversed, because it's not good for us. It's bad for our society if we start regarding China as an enemy, because that's what's happening. I mean, that was the implication of this latest announcement that we had, that we've got to get nuclear-powered submarines and go back on a gigantic contract with the French in order to stave off these frightful people who are a threat to us and it's an enemy to Australia. I don't regard China as an enemy. I think the best way to make it an enemy is to go on all the time about how it's an enemy, and I think it's better to regard it as a friend. And I think that's safer too, much safer. I think it's disgraceful that we go back on billions of dollars of contracts and then accuse them of going back on contracts. I just really think it's terrible.
On that note, I think it's time to open it to all our participants. Now, to give you an idea of how I would like us to run this session,
right?
I think I've now allowed people who've been muted to unmute themselves when they want to ask a question, okay? And the way I would like people to let me know that they wish to ask a question is by clicking the icon reactions, right? If you were to do that now, but don't do the next bit, you can see that there is a hand with thumb up. That's the one you click. And I will then see that you have done that, and I will recognize you. Would you please undo any clicking of thumb that you've done now? Do not do that now. Or any, no, right. Now I'm going to show you, I'm going to put up on the screen 8 themes. And I'm going to ask for questions. Everyone needs to be very disciplined if we're going to get maximum advantage from this period that we've got left till 4 o'clock. I'd like you to address your question if it is relevant to the theme we're dealing with. We're going to go through theme 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And if at the end of that, your question is not covered by any of those themes, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask the question. I doubt that there'll be many questions not covered by the 8 themes. So when we come to theme number 1, which we haven't come to yet, but we'll shortly, and you're interested in asking a question directly relevant to that theme, not simply at the margins, please click that icon, which is the hand with the thumb up. No. Yes, that's the one I'm going to take. Okay, now I'm going to put up on the screen the key themes. Just look at them. Chinese history and culture, you may have a question on that, or the communist revolution and what has happened since 49 under the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party, China's economic rise and its significance, the problems that have been associated with that economic rise, the levels of inequality and environment. We've touched on this, but there may be questions on any of these themes that you feel you'd like to know more about or have some further discussion on. The role of China's minorities and human rights issues more broadly, China's role on the world stage, Australia-China relations, which is what we've just been talking about, and then other for any questions that may not be covered by these 7 things. So what I'm going to do now is to stick to the first one, Chinese history and culture, okay? So now we're going to go to the process I've mentioned. So if there are any people who would like to ask a question relevant to the first topic, you can certainly let me know. And by the way, anyone who doesn't want to ask a question right now, please don't unmute yourself because we're hearing background noises otherwise, and we don't want that. So, is there a question to do with the first topic I mentioned a moment ago, which is the question of
culture.
Of Chinese history and culture?
Yes,
I see that there are some, so let's go to those. Now I have to find them. Yes, so there are, I think, 5. John Ball, 1.
thanks, Joe, and thank you, Colin. Given the controversy at the moment around the South China Sea and possession of islands and militarization, Colin, are you able to tell us a little bit about the background of why they're in dispute, like the islands there?
It's all to do with the previous French administration in Vietnam, and it became, they claimed it. Then in 1947, China put out just before the Communist Party came in, put out a statement saying that it was their territory because based on a historical thing with the French having been defeated. And it became all very complicated after that, but a whole range of other countries also said they had a stake. And it became very, very complicated. Yeah, that's a bit about the background. As for the rights and wrongs of the situation, I don't see. I see a lot of wrongs and not that many rights in what they're doing. I mean, the fact is, China's not the only one that makes these claims. I think it may be the only one that has the. Actually, I don't think it's even the only one that's making islands. That's building islands. But I guess my main point is I'm not going to justify everything China does in this, but I'm not going to put all the blame on them either. I just think that this can be read several ways. And what you said, as I said before, what I think, I don't mind them having greater influence. What I mind is if they are going to send out troops and expand their territory all the time. And that, I don't see the signs of that happening. And as I've just mentioned, the background of the South China Sea, I would include that as well.
Okay. John Abel? Unmute yourself.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to ask a question in terms of, you mentioned that China has advanced industrially, which is a good thing in many ways. It's also caused a huge ecological problem for China. I think this ramping up of a very warlike stance towards China that Trump and the Australian government has been engaged in is extremely dangerous. I think what we need to do, and it's a very difficult question thing to do, is basically get cooperation between different governments around the world to save the planet for future generations.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, as
prepared to do that, I'm not sure.
Yes, thanks, John. Colin?
well, I just was going to say, as far as the ecology is concerned, the environment, China has not done well at all. And that's one of the reasons, that's one of the bad sides of industrialization that it's overcome, that it's undertaken in the last few decades. However, let's be fair. They have, in the last few years, definitely adopted policies of trying to overcome this problem. And I mean, as somebody who's lived in Beijing many times over quite a long period, I would say that it's got better in the last few years. It got much worse for quite a long time. I would concede that, but it's got better in the last few years. And I mean, there was a statement put out. It's the same statement as the one I quoted about the maternity mortality rates, about particulates in the atmosphere and that sort of thing, and quality of water and that sort of thing, which is so important to people, and they're so important to governments too. And they show some kinds of improvements. I mean, maybe they're not as big as improvements as we would like, but all I can say is I think that we have to cooperate over this environmental question, because it's a non-trivial thing and it's getting very, very urgent. So, I mean, all I can say is I agree with John.
Thanks. Now, what I'm going to do now is ask all those that have put up their hand, well, 3 or 4 of you, to ask your question. And because hopefully it is related, I think, in fact, some of the questions are jumping the gun. What I'm going to do again is to share with you the thing. You can now see them, and I'll make it a little bit bigger.
Oh, yeah.
So please try and stick to the particular topic that we're dealing with at the moment. In any case, we have 3 or 4. I think Maxine, Barry, Jeff Waugh, and Ron Beer, and Beatrice Bastovsky. So each of you, please ask your question, and then we'll see what Colin makes of it.
We go one by one, or
no? We'll try and get them all in case of commonalities.
All right.
Don't repeat yourself. Yes.
We'll all talk at once, will we?
No, one after the other. So first, Maxine Barry.
Okay. Colin, I was in China in 1972, Christmas period, just before diplomatic recognition.
Right.
And I was very struck by the valorization of workers and peasants in the culture.
Yeah.
And I got to witness the ballet, the white-haired girl, and a few others.
Yeah, I love that.
Me too. I actually bought the 78 record of the music because I loved it so much. I just wondered whether, well, I've got a sort of double bunger question, whether any of those revolutionary artworks are ever exhibited again. But the other thing too was the valorization of artworks.
Excuse me, sorry, Maxine. Someone is unmuted and there's noise in the background.
Yes, I know, I can hear them.
Please mute yourself unless you're asking a question.
Yeah, can I answer Maxine's questions before we go on, Joseph?
Okay.
I just want to say that question, valorizing workers and peasants, that's rather attached to the Cultural Revolution. You don't find it nearly so much now as you did then, but I won't say it's gone out by any means. And I mean, that's part of the whole question of equality, because I do think it's important.
These are themes for question and answer. Yeah. These things, I don't know what to click on to ask the question.
Raise hand.
Raise your hand. That's what
also going to going to ask about the extraordinary level.
Maxine, we have to move on. I'm sorry,
Yes.
but there's a whole string of people wanting to ask questions
I
and
am
make brief
interrupting me.
comments. So can we now hear from, and please, when you've spoken, finished your question or brief comment, please mute yourself again. Now, Jeff Waugh. Jeff?
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Joseph. I'm Australian, Chinese Australian, living here for 17 years.
Yeah.
Now, I have 3 questions in terms of this part. One, you mentioned about Boxer Rebellion.
Yeah.
In 1900, right?
I did.
My question is, do you know, as a scholar, how many commissionaries died during that conflict, which is the root reason for these 8 nations invade China? Second question is, who declared war first, China part or 8 nations? Third, during the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, how many people died?
Yep. Okay.
Thank you.
Now, as for the first one about the, look, first of all, can I answer one about the revolutionary ballet that Maxine asked? My answer is there are still some performances, but they're not nearly as many as they used to be. I could talk a whole lot about that, but that's the brief answer. Now, as for the boxers, the 8 powers were not invited by China, and they took a lead. It was first of all a German commander. And as for who declared war, well, I don't think it really matters very much. I think there wasn't a sort of a question of declaring war. It was a question of an invasion by 8 powers who were cooperating with each other for the only time in history, I would like to add. Never again and never before have those particular 8 countries cooperated in war. They were usually fighting at each other's throats in those days. Now, as for the number of people who died during the Great Leap Forward, there is a whole literature about this, and there is a lot of discussion. And I am afraid I can't possibly say which is right. There's been books written to put forward particular figures, but there were a lot. That's if you don't mind, that's what I would like to say. A lot. And I don't think I want to be more precise than that because it's just nobody really knows the number.
Thumbs up sign that you mentioned, I couldn't see it anywhere.
Well, all I can say is
here.
You know, the Chinese government, the State Statistical Bureau, they call it, National Bureau of Statistics, right. They put out population figures every year.
Got my hand up, yeah.
Excuse me, anyone who is not asking a question, you have to mute yourself. Otherwise, I will not recognize you. You have to mute. So, Michael Weiner, you're not muted, I don't think.
No, can you hear me?
You're not supposed to hear.
Now he's muted. Now, yes. As far as that, I just wanted to say, the State Statistical Bureau puts out population figures for every year. And then the figure for 1960 was actually lower than 59. And that suggests a lot of deficit because it should be higher, you know? And then the same happened the next year. So 2 years in a row, the official population of the whole country was actually lower than the preceding year. Now, what the reason for it must be because of a famine or because of, people weren't having babies anymore. But I mean, there's no doubt that something was very much amiss. That's really, I don't know more precise figures than that.
Okay, now, Ron Beer?
Yes, I'm very interested in what you have to say, Colin. But what I wanted to ask, you mentioned before about the power of the media being very anti-China.
Yeah.
I think it's also very pertinent to keep in mind what America's policy is and how it impacts on Australia.
I agree.
Our foreign policy in terms of China. What's your comment on
Well, my comment is that I think, as I said in the original thing, I think part of the reason for the whole thing was that Trump brought in these tariffs, and then the American government formally declared China a strategic rival, a competitor, not a partner. And those things can only make a bad, because the Americans were starting to get very excited because the trade was going down, but it was their initiative that made that happen. They put up these barriers. Then they said that China was benefiting from their economic growth, and that all the jobs were going to China. No, I'm not saying all that's nonsense, but I am saying that the Trump administration deliberately went out of its way to demonize China over this trade question, and then over all kinds of other things, especially human rights in Xinjiang and Hong Kong and various other things. They went out of their way to demonize them, and that has an effect on Australia. And of course, in the meantime, we also, I mean, it's not entirely, we do have some agency, but I think we were tending to follow, in the media, because we get so much of our information from those Americans, and it's not that we do have agency, but I just think that if without the American decline, it would have been different. And then, of course, there's the whole pandemic question, because that made a big difference. That the Chinese found it so insulting that we, as a reasonably small nation, were taking the lead in trying to put them on trial, which is in effect certainly that's how they saw it. And of course, the Australian government said it didn't see it like that. They said, how can you possibly object to an investigation into such a matter? We need to prevent that happening again. Well, of course we do. But I think that the circumstances under which they called for this just made it sound as if they were putting China on trial. And I think that the way Trump went on in his last year in the government, he said, it's China's fault. The whole thing is China's fault. And the Biden administration seems to be taking on some of this. They're saying they've got an investigation going, and it's just all so unfortunate, I think.
Thanks, Colin. Now, listen, people, I'm going to admit complete defeat. We're going to ditch my beautifully constructed 7 or 8 themes, and because the questions that have already been posed cover a lot of different themes. So we'll just take the people that are putting up their hand and saying, I have something I want to share. So with Beatrice, if I may now turn to you.
Thank you. Colin, it is actually a history question.
A history question?
A history question.
Yeah, good.
One not of hundreds of years ago, but of about 50 years ago.
Right.
The matter with Hong Kong. With the agreement as to what will happen with Hong Kong. For example, the chief parliamentary drafter of the state of Victoria went to Hong Kong to write, to draft laws. These, of course, now have totally been incinerated, It seems to me that China talks about becoming humiliated or just happenings when it suits them. They broke the international agreement with the matter of Hong Kong. You haven't really mentioned Hong Kong. How can we view this without concern?
Thank you, Beatrice.
Well, I think we should view it with concern, but I also think that there's another point of view. And let me say how I view that. As far as law is concerned, I mean, there was a treaty, an agreement reached in 1898 that Hong Kong would be handed back. You know, 99-year lease on part of Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And then when the British claimed it to raise this again between Deng Xiaoping and Margaret Thatcher, they had actually bilateral agreements, and they came to an agreement which resulted in a basic law. Now, the Chinese, on the whole, have abided by that basic law. They haven't to now. The thing is, they brought in a national security law. That's true, but there's nothing to say that they can't do that. Moreover, the reason why they brought in a national security law was because there had been very, very big demonstrations over months, which they'd really done very little to do anything about, even though they were getting more and more violent. And it seems to me that they were leading to the possibility that Hong Kong would claim to be independent. Now, the first thing of that basic law says Hong Kong is part of China. One country, two systems. One country. Hong Kong is part of China. Now, if that's going to be challenged, and it looked as if demonstrators were challenging that, they said that the liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our time and things like that. The Americans getting very, very involved and saying, oh, this is wonderful. How dare anybody suppress peaceful demonstrations, which they weren't doing, by the way. And then eventually China decided that it had to take in a national security law. Now, I can't see, I think that is highly defensible. What I also would like to add, and why I think you're right to say we should be concerned, and that is that the extent of freedom seems to be less. It's obviously less. I don't know that it's that much less, mind you, but I think it's certainly declined, and that's a pity as far as I'm concerned. But I think that, I just don't think it's possible to put all the blame on the Chinese for that. And I also think that the way the West and the American administration and our government has been going on about this, as if it's a vast human rights abuse, I really don't think that's fair. I think it is a human rights abuse, but I think it is also a question of national security. And we care a lot about our national security. I don't think it's unreasonable that they should care about theirs. And I also think that as far as law is concerned, there have been several articles in Pearls and Irritations that Joe quoted earlier by lawyers who work in China, who are not Chinese. They're still British lawyers who work in China. That's saying that the law, the Chinese haven't really broken the law. So, I think there's two ways of looking at this. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. Now, if I may, I want to move on. And I think there is Michelle Smith. Would you like to put your question, please, Michelle?
Thank you very much, Colin. So I have to say I share your outrage at what I see as warmongering.
Yeah.
So
terrible.
The one-child policy was a great example of a proactive population policy.
Yeah.
Could you please comment on the demise of the one-child policy and also the projected size of the Chinese population?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. The one-child policy came in the late 70s. I think it did have the effect of reducing the growth of population, quite to a very large extent. And then a two-child policy was brought in a few years ago. And then I think it was 2015, I can't remember the precise date. And then a three-child policy was brought in just a year or so ago. Now, I have quite a lot of friends in China. Most of them are quite happy to just have one. They think that the second one is they've got their career and all that sort of thing to think about. And the reason why I think it was changed was because a lot of economists think that it's bad for the economy if the dependency ratio gets too out of whack. See, the dependency ratio means the proportion of people who contribute to the economy, which is mainly those between certain ages, doesn't count children and old people, and those who are, need to feed from the economy without contributing so much to it. You don't want that too much out of whack. You don't want to have too many people that are growing old and not contributing anymore, because the life expectancy has got much more, and that's a good thing in my opinion. But now, people say, well, you need to have more children. It's better for the society and it's better for the economy, and it probably is. But now, you said, what about figures? The figure that I think is really the most interesting is that sometime in the next few years, meaning 4 or 5, well, you can't be too precise about these things, India will overtake China. In other words, they will both reach, China is now, according to the most recent census, 1.41 billion. India looks to be getting towards that, and in a few years, it will overtake China and continue to grow, but China will go to its maximum extent and then start declining. Not because people are being killed or anything like that, but because not as many people are being born, and the whole age range is got slightly out of whack. In fact, more than slightly, because this one-child policy has gone for a long time. Now, on the one hand, it's a good thing that they have controlled the population. On the other hand, it's not such a good thing. I mean, it's a good thing because, as we all know, the higher the population, the greater the strain on the environment, the greater the strain on the social resources and things of that sort. But on the other hand, if you don't have children and replace the population, if people get a lot of people getting old, I mean, that's one of the things that's been happening as the standard of living has gone up, so has the life expectancy at birth. People live to be longer. I've got a friend, I know she's Canadian, but she's 106 living in Beijing, going on quite happily. She's been living in Beijing almost all her life. Anyway, I mean, that's also the Chinese people. They are getting, their life expectancy is going up. And I think that's a good thing. But I mean, then those other questions that you raise, I mean, they're non-trivial, and we have to deal with them. And I think that is the reason why they've changed the policy. But I really think it's very interesting that we're going to see India overtake. It's the first time in history that people under the Chinese government are not the most populous in the world. I mean, if you compare Han Dynasty China with the Roman Empire, Han Dynasty had quite a lot more people. And if you compare British India with China at the time was considerably bigger, even though British India covered a very, very large territory. So now, it's going to be changed, and that's really interesting, and it's really important too, in my opinion. And as for what demographers will say, economists and so on, and the impact on society, those are going to be big. Exactly how to predict them, I'm afraid I can't, but I
don't think anyone can, Colin.
Yeah, that's what I have to say.
Okay, now questions, because time is moving. Questions as brief as possible, and I'll ask Colin to also be as brief as possible,
yeah, okay,
in order to get 2 more questions in.
I'll be briefer.
Casey, unmute.
Thanks, Joe, and thank you very much, Colin. You mentioned earlier about your hope that attitudes in Australia will change.
I did.
I'm just wondering if, with this AUKUS pact on Thursday, is there any possibility or probability that Australia's course in terms of its strategic interests are set. And if China is going to relent in any way because of this, and if you can speculate, what are the implications for Australia, bilateral interests for Australia within the region and with the other countries?
Well, I see it very negatively. I think it's a complete disaster and extremely stupid to take this AUKUS. I mean, what are the implications? What we're being told is that it's all right for us to cancel a multi-billion contract with a perfectly respectable country in order that we can fawn on the Americans and get their technology, that we can become a nuclear-powered, nuclear-powered submarine. It's going to take ages to get these. It's not going to increase our defence capability. It certainly angers the Chinese because they see themselves as pictured as the enemy, and aren't they? I mean, you say we say we're going to have all these things and these nuclear-powered submarines, and what are they for? They're aimed against China. And then, the Minister of Defence, Peter Dutton, and meets with Franklin, the American counterpart, and they're obviously aimed against China. So what's China going to think? That it's the enemy. How's it going to react? Well, I think it is extremely unlikely that it will start making war against Australia. Why would it do that? I mean, it's got nothing to gain by doing that. But I don't think it's out of the question that it will, maintain a negative attitude towards Australia. And it might, if it's really going to be awful, I hope it doesn't do this, and I think it's unlikely. But it could say, well, it's a national security threat for us to be getting something like iron ore from Australia. What if they would suddenly say, oh, we're not going to do it, and that means that our defence will be threatened? I mean, that's the kind of logic that's, it's so awful, such a silly logic. But I mean, that's the kind of logic that we've been using. And I just think this is, you asked me to speculate. My speculation is that it makes us less safe than we were before, that it makes us more like a pawn of the Americans, if not a part of the American defence, capability. We're paying money to them to sell us these things, and what do we get out of it? I mean, what's it going to be like in? I know Peter Dutton and those people. They talk about 3 decades into the future, but we can't predict what it's going to be like then. And I really think it is extremely unlikely that China is going to be wanting to make war against Australia. Of course, if I could return to that question of Taiwan, and I mentioned already, that's very worrying. It seems to me if there is a war in Taiwan, we should keep out of it. I can't see that it's in Australia's interest to have anything to do with it, but we won't be able to keep out of it now. The Americans will assume, the Taiwan people, the Taiwan government, they will assume that we're going to take part in the whole thing on their side. And I just think that's totally flat against our interests. We should be trying to be friends with China.
All right. Well, thank you for that. That was an interesting question, and thanks, Colin, for an equally interesting answer. Now, Ian Fry. Ian, unmute yourself.
Thank you, Joe. Colin, I would like you to reflect on the impact of the Bridge and Road Plan being introduced in 2012, and my assessment that this is the basis of all of the problems we're seeing today, because what it amounted to was that China was trying to do what the non-Western world has failed to be able to do for 70 years, that is, introduce a totally new international economic order with a drift in trade and policy influence shifting from the West to the non-West. And the West is desperately trying to prevent that by every means it can, so that it points to things like the South China Sea Islands, which are a defensive mechanism, not an offensive mechanism, and it places Australia in a position where we will become nothing more than a sovereign forward defence state.
Yeah, well,
I think Colin, I think you've covered a lot of this ground already.
I've covered a lot of this, yeah. But I think that the Belt and Road is a good thing for the world in general. But I agree with your point about the how the West reacts to it. Can I just make one other point? The West, I belong to the West. I want the West to do well, but I have to say that I think it is not God-given that the West has to be on top all the time. Why can't we get on with each other instead of just regarding ourselves as being number one? Because that's what they do. That's what the Americans do. They will not treat anybody as an equal. And we seem to be taking that on as well. I mean, what happened was that in the 18th century, Europe had the Enlightenment, which was a very good thing, in my opinion. And then it had the Industrial Revolution. Well, that's got some disadvantages, but overall we can't do without it. And then it went out and conquered the world in the 19th century. That's not such a good thing. But then it got to assume that it was on top and that anything it did, it was the seat of virtue, you know. It was the one that could dictate what was good and what was bad. And it was the one who would dictate how the world was run. And I mean, that's one way of looking at the thing, but I just don't think that that's a God-given proposition. And I don't think it necessarily has to be forever. And I don't think it's necessarily such a terrible thing if it's not forever. It's not that Western civilization is going to go away. Of course it's not. We'll stay and we'll enjoy Western civilization. But I can't see that if somebody else also, you know, rises, that means that we've got to go out of business. No, we can get on with each other.
Okay, now, Laurel, I think you had your hand up. Laurel Thomas.
Hi, Joe and Colin.
Hi.
I'm just interested in the question of unification of China and the question of Taiwan.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, who do you think gets the priority? Is it the Chinese government who wishes to unify the country, or is it the people of Taiwan who don't want to be unified? And I relate this to the Falklands War, the people in the Falklands who didn't want to be Argentinian. I mean, they're very close to Argentina. You could say it'd be much more sensible if they were unified with Argentina, and yet Argentina wants that. But the people of the Falkland Islands wanted to remain British. So who gets priority in these sort of situations?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. And I think the answer is at the moment, as far as the Americans are concerned, and it's they want to keep their power, but they see that as through the people of Taiwan wanting to become independent. China doesn't see it like that at all. Who's going to get the top say? Well, I mean, I think in cases of these things, this will vary often according to the circumstances. And again, I don't want to say right and wrong, but my guess is that the wishes of the people of Taiwan will not be the top priority. It will be a priority, but I doubt it'll be the top priority. I think the national interests of the Americans and the Chinese are likely to be a higher priority. We'll have to wait and see. It's a very worrying situation. I have to agree with you about that.
Casing Chua.
Thank you, Colin. I'm going to have a very quick question. Let's leave all the blame aside. I think both governments are at fault, China and Australia. But I want to ask Colin, can you think of good solution to break this frozen Australian-China relation? I think the government had to do the break. The both government had to do the break to come to a constructive diplomacy to solve the current situation. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I really wish I knew the answer. I don't have the proper answer, but I think that we should stop trying to insult them, which is what we're doing and continue to do. I think we should stop framing them as the enemy, and I think that they should be more conciliatory towards the whole question than they have been up to now. But I would like to say what I really hope for is some real leader who will try and, come and break the ice, because that's what happened last time round. I remember when I first went to China, the Chinese were going on the way they're going on now towards Australia. We didn't even have diplomatic relations. But then somebody, did Kissinger and Whitlam and Steve Fitzgerald. He contributed, quite a number of people contributed towards breaking this, and I hope that will happen again. Unfortunately, I don't see the signs of the leaders that we need. But look, I wish I could answer your question, and that's really all I can do at the moment.
Thank you. That's good.
All right. Now, Cheryl Greet, please. Cheryl?
I just had to find myself, sorry.
That's okay.
I've almost forgotten my question. Mine was about the current problem, inequality and environment. And I recognise just how much, China has gained economically and socially, and just the lives of the people and the confidence.
Yeah.
And, and now I just wonder, there's 1 billion Chinese people. We have always had, I personally have always had that freedom and that enough money, the one house and the holiday house, like the vast majority of Australians, middle-class Australians, which made it such a wonderful place to live because everyone had a go. The inequality now is that, if you come from a country where you've been so controlled, it's like a child brought up in a family where they've been controlled to the point that they can't do anything, and you let them out and it's like a kid in a lolly shop. They want everything. And my concern is that, we've always been contented to just have our one house and our holiday house and let everyone else have their one house and their holiday house. But there's a growing amount of greed where people, I personally haven't had any prejudice, but I just feel that, sometimes people have sensitivities, that they've built up over time. And it's not necessarily that people are treating them badly. It's just that they have this inbuilt feeling of insecurity, really. And as you said, wanting to exert influence and be number one. So my danger is with the people who, are a bit insecure and need to be number one, no matter what country they are, whether they're American. The Americans had 70% of the wealth in the hands of 7 families or something. My worry now is that we're moving towards that there's this massive, Chinese people are very capable and they work very hard. And I acknowledge that and respect that, but it also means that the people who are a bit lazier like me, who don't work that hard and like to have holidays and like to have a work balance, being with my family and children and value community and, gardening and nature, that we don't become so obsessed with making money.
Cheryl, we're running out of time.
I've got off the point. I'll stop. I kind of rambled. I suppose the main point, going back, inequality, the rising, the rising wealth, a lot of wealthy and a lot of poor.
I already talked about that in the sense that I think that this Xi Jinping's bringing in this idea about common prosperity, he calls it, and he wants to make it a bit more equal. I agree with all the things you said. I think people do. I mean, human nature is human nature, etc. But I guess I would like to add a couple of points. I think that the Chinese have you know, they're more focused than we are. I don't know, maybe it's the circumstances, but I also think their tradition is less the consumer type tradition than ours. Of course, that may change. I don't know. But I do think that the Xi Jinping, in response to this question about inequality, has brought in this idea about common prosperity, and he's tried to, you know, take the, you know, crack down, that is the term that the press likes to use, on the really top, you know, the really big, rich people, in order to try and begin a process of redistributing the wealth. I mean, I wish him well if he can do that, because I think it does need to be a bit more equal. But I really don't know what the future holds in that respect. But I mean, as for China, I don't know that it was bad or badly off. It's quite a number of other places in this respect.
We're coming to the last question because time is really moving on.
Can I add something, please?
Not at the moment. I'm sorry. There are so many people listed that we're not going to get to them. That's the way it goes. It's wonderful to have all these questions, but we can't do, or people wanting to ask questions, but so sad we can't do them justice today. But there was one, and I apologize that I have overlooked him, and that was Michael Wiener. So if I may give you the last word, Michael, would you like to pose your question, please? Unmute if you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
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 Regarding the problem in the South China Sea, how can the Communist Party in China justify completely ignoring the law of the sea regarding territory? That's it, really.
Because it claims that it's Chinese territory based on history.
Oh, okay.
And it does have a claim in that respect, because others have claims too. But that's what it claims, and it's just as other great powers ignore laws when it doesn't suit them, they can do that. But personally, I think the whole thing is very, very fraught, and I think that we should be, you know, being very, very careful about how we proceed in these sorts of matters.
On this question, it should be said that ASEAN, the Southeast Asian countries, the 10, have been for some time trying to engage China in arriving at a code of conduct regarding the South China Sea. And Australia, I assume, if it were properly inclined, should associate itself with those ASEAN efforts. What do you think, Colin?
I think so. I think that's right. I mean, I think we should keep out of it, really. We should keep out of it. And they can settle it for themselves.
Well, the point is that they're controlling the sea lanes for trade. Is that the reason why they're doing it?
What I understand, look, I'm not a complete expert, but what I understand is that it's military they're interested in. And the trade just goes anyway. The trade routes are still open. It's the military that they're concerned about.
Okay.
Now, are they being aggressive? Because from what you've said, your whole tone is that the Chinese are conciliatory, and providing you don't provoke them, you know, that they're not really interested in conflict. Well, that seems to be completely against their attitude in the Chinese seas regarding their military build-up.
Well, I mean, I don't accept that. I accept what I read from the South China Sea is that they, as I already said, that they claim that as part of their territory, and that it's the whole question of being provoked by a whole range of people. And it seems to me that we should try and adopt a way where we get on with each other.
I agree.
Now, while I'm not prepared to justify everything that the Chinese do in the South China Sea or anywhere else that it comes to that, I don't think it suggests that they're a totally aggressive nationalist power. that is bent on inflicting war and taking over the area and things of that sort. I think they are wanting to increase their influence, certainly, but not. I don't think it's a dangerous country. No.
Okay.
I certainly don't think they want to.
On that note, I think we'll need to bring this forum to a close. We said 2 to 4, and we've gained an awful lot from Colin over the last 2 hours, and I don't think it would be right either for the participants or for him, for that matter, to drag it on beyond more or less our closing time. I just want to bring to your attention another event before we break off, which is also very critical to our future and Southeast Asia in particular, and that is the situation in Myanmar. And Pax Christi will be holding an event which may be of interest to several of you or to many of you. So I hope you will take note. It'll be on the 17th of October. It's on your screen, and you would all be most welcome. How can we express solidarity with the people of Myanmar in their hour of need at this time? 17th of October, same time, Sunday, for those of you who are interested, and we will be letting all of you know by email and other means over the next week or two. But just a date to save if that issue is of interest to you. All right, well, let me conclude by thanking all the participants. I apologize to all those of you who wanted to ask a question but did not get the opportunity. I hope this is only the first of many more discussions, on China. This is one of the most critical issues of our time. And what it raises, and I think Colin has spoken about this, is that we're seeing not just a power shift, and certainly we are, relative power shift, away from the West to the East, or as I like to call it, from Occident to Orient, in which China plays a critical role, obviously, but we're seeing a civilizational shift. And that's what makes it so difficult for the West to stomach, that there is a different civilization. It's not just from Spain to Portugal to France to Britain, the shifting of leadership of power in the world. It is from a Western civilization to a non-Western civilization at this point in time to Chinese civilization. And that is a very bitter pill to have to swallow if you've been dominant as the West for 3 centuries or close to. So, and Australia identifying with one rather than the other finds that very difficult as well. So there is much to think about. And as I like to say, the big challenge facing Australia today is how to reconcile its history and its geography. And if it's able to do that, it'll go places. If it finds the going very difficult, I suspect there'll be blood and tears ahead of us. So let's hope history and geography reconcile themselves. So let me now thank all the participants, those who had a chance to make their voices heard and those who didn't. Thank you for your participation. We had about 200 people in attendance, and we appreciate that very much. On behalf of Pax Christi, I thank all of you. I thank the helpers that make the event possible, and a very special thank you to Colin.
Thank you to you, Joe. I've enjoyed this greatly.
And it's been a pleasure and a privilege to have you with us. Thank you again. Till we see you again in the not too distant future.
Hope so.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye to everyone now.
Bye.